She was the kind of woman nobody looked at twice. That was the thing about Alma Reeves. She had spent the better part of a decade making herself small. Keeping her cardigan buttoned to the top, her hair pulled back so tight it gave her a headache by noon. Her voice pitched just low enough that people had to ask her to repeat herself, which she hated, but it was better than being noticed, better than being seen. She worked as a bookkeeper for Castellan Freight and Logistics, a company that moved cargo through the port of Baltimore. On paper, it was a legitimate shipping operation, mid-size, profitable, unremarkable. Alma had been hired by a soft-spoken HR manager named Deborah, who wore too much floral perfume and told her the benefits were excellent. She had believed Deborah. She had believed a lot of things back then. It didn't take long for a woman who was good with numbers to understand that some of the numbers didn't add up. The discrepancies were subtle. A holding fee recorded on a Tuesday that should have been a Thursday. A dock fee that was 3 times what any legitimate operator would charge. Disbursements categorized as equipment maintenance that had no corresponding invoices. Someone had tried to make it all look clean. They were good at it. But they weren't as good as Alma. She said nothing. She catalogued everything in her head, noted it in a private ledger she kept encrypted on a personal drive at home, and continued arriving at 7:45 every morning, leaving at 5:30 every evening, and eating her lunch alone at her desk because the break room made her nervous. She was plain, she was quiet, and she was invisible. That was how she survived. The executive floor was 40 feet above her head and might as well have been a different country. She knew the name Rourke the way every employee did, the way you know the name of a weather system, something large and distant and capable of devastating things. Callum Rourke, CEO officially. She had never seen him in person. He came in through a private entrance, held meetings behind closed doors, and the entire building seemed to hold its breath when word spread that he was in the building. Grown men in tailored suits straightened their ties when his car pulled into the garage. She had watched it happen from her window on 3 separate occasions, and found it fascinating in the same detached way. She found most things fascinating, at a careful remove, like studying something through glass. The morning everything went wrong was a Thursday in October. She knew it was going to be difficult before she even sat down. Her coffee had gone cold on the walk from the parking garage. The servers were running slow, and the third-quarter audit report she'd been assembling for 6 weeks had a line item that didn't reconcile no matter how many times she ran the figures. A transfer of $412,000, routed through a holding subsidiary she'd never seen used before. Time-stamped at 2:17 in the morning on a date that coincided with a large incoming shipment from Rotterdam. She stared at it for a long time. Then she did what she always did. She saved her work, locked her screen, and went to refill her coffee. She needed to think. The hallway outside the accounting department was empty. The building felt quieter than usual for a Thursday morning. The dock foremen were nowhere in the lobby. The freight manager's office down the hall had its blinds closed, which was unusual. Alma noticed these things. She always noticed things. She just didn't talk about them. She was walking back from the break room when she heard voices behind the closed door of the loading manifest room. A small, rarely used space between accounting and the rear stairwell. She wouldn't have paused, except that one of the voices was raised in a way that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The other voice was very quiet. The kind of quiet that meant the person using it didn't need to raise their voice. She kept walking. She was back at her desk, both hands wrapped around her mug, when the door to accounting opened and 2 men she had never seen before stepped inside. They were wearing suits, which wasn't unusual on the executive floor, but was deeply unusual down here, where everyone dressed for spreadsheets and cargo manifests, and the general understanding that sometimes you had to walk through a warehouse. One of the men had a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. The other one was looking at his phone. "Alma Reeves," said the one with the scar. Not a question. She set down her coffee very carefully. "Yes. Come with us, please." She thought about saying no. She thought about asking why. She looked at the way they were standing, the small, deliberate positioning of their bodies that blocked both the door and the aisle between the cubicles, and understood that neither of those options would help her. She picked up her bag. "Leave that," said the one with the scar. She left it. They took her up the rear stairwell, not the elevator, not the main corridor, and then out through the side exit into a black SUV that had been idling at the curb with a third man behind the wheel. Nobody spoke during the drive. Alma watched the streets of Baltimore scroll past the tinted windows and told herself to stay calm. She ran the numbers in her head. $412,000. Rotterdam. 2:17 in the morning. She thought about the encrypted drive at home on her nightstand. She thought about Deborah and her floral perfume and the excellent benefits. She thought she was probably about to die. The SUV pulled into a warehouse district she didn't recognize. Long, low buildings set back from the waterfront, flood lamps mounted high on rusted poles, the smell of diesel and salt water that the city never quite managed to rinse out. They walked her inside a building that was larger than it looked from outside, with exposed rafters and the ambient mechanical hum of a space that was used for serious work. The kind of work that required a lot of square footage and not too many questions. There was a chair. They sat her in it. "Wait here," said the man with the scar. She waited. The building wasn't empty. She could hear movement, footsteps, the low murmur of a conversation happening somewhere out of sight, the distant sound of a vehicle reversing outside. A man in all black stood near the far wall and didn't look at her. She looked at him anyway. She had been sitting there for approximately 22 minutes. She'd counted, because counting things helped her think. When she heard the doors at the far end of the space open, she didn't have to be told who it was. Callum Rourke was not what she had expected. She had built a version of him in her head, over 3 years of working in his building. Something vague and monolithic, a shape more than a person. The reality was quieter than she'd imagined. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of dark coloring that comes from Southern European blood a couple of generations back. His suit was black. His tie was loosened by exactly 1/2 inch. He moved the way very dangerous people moved, without hesitation, without wasted motion, as though the floor had already agreed to cooperate with him before he got there. He crossed the warehouse without looking at her. He stopped at the far side and spoke briefly to the man with the scar. Then he turned around, and for the first time, Callum Rourke looked at Alma Reeves. She had expected cold. She had expected the kind of assessment that strips a person down to their usefulness and finds them lacking. She was good at anticipating that. She had been anticipating it her whole life. What she hadn't expected was for him to be quiet for a long moment before he said anything at all. "You found the Rotterdam transfer," he said. It wasn't a question either. "Yes," she said. "How long have you known something was wrong with the books?" She thought about lying. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds, and then decided it would waste both their time. "About 14 months, she said. Something shifted in his face. "Very small. And you said nothing. I documented it," she said. "I have a private ledger, encrypted. I kept it because I didn't know who I was dealing with and I didn't want to end up in a situation like this one." She paused. That plan clearly worked out very well. Silence. Then, unexpectedly, Callum Rourke said, "What's in the ledger?" "Everything," she said. "Every discrepancy, every misrouted disbursement, every holding company shell that shouldn't exist. 14 months of documentation." She kept her hands in her lap. She was proud of how steady they were. "I also know about the subsidiary that's been skimming from the Rotterdam line for the past 8 months. I know it's not you, because the account trail leads to someone who has secondary signatory access and has been escalating the amounts in increments small enough that they didn't trigger the internal review threshold. I know it's your CFO. His name is Leonard Graff, and he's been doing it since March. The warehouse was very quiet. You knew it was Graff, Rourke said, and it wasn't quite a statement and wasn't quite a question. I suspected. The timing of the transfers matched his access windows. The subsidiary was incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago, 2 weeks after he returned from a trip to the Cayman Islands that wasn't on the company calendar. She looked at him steadily. I'm very good with numbers. Callum Rourke stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then he said, Why didn't you go to the authorities? And say what? I'm the bookkeeper for a company I'm fairly certain is a front for organized crime, and here's my 14 months of private documentation that I assembled without telling anyone. She held his gaze. That's not a conversation I particularly wanted to have. He almost smiled. She was nearly certain of it. It was very brief. Stay here, he said. He walked away. She heard a door open and close. She sat in the chair in the middle of the warehouse and told herself to breathe and thought about Leonard Graff, and wondered if she was going to get out of this building. She did not find out for another 3 hours. It was nearly 8 in the evening when the man with the scar, whose name turned out to be Perrault, though she didn't learn that until later, told her she could leave and that a car would take her home. She was also told that she should come to work tomorrow as normal, that she was not to speak of today to anyone, and that someone would be in touch. She went home. She fed her cat, a large, disapproving tabby named Wallace, and stood at her kitchen window for a long time, looking at nothing. Then she took a shower, made toast because she couldn't manage anything more complicated, and sat at her kitchen table until almost midnight, turning the day over in her head. She went to work the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th morning, Leonard Graff did not come to work. She overheard 2 of the freight managers talking in low voices about a sudden leave of absence. Something about personal matters, nobody quite sure of the details. By Friday, his office had been emptied. Nobody came to tell her anything. Nobody acknowledged what had happened. She sat at her desk and balanced the 3rd quarter audit and told herself this was fine. She was very good at telling herself things were fine. What she was not good at, what she had never been good at, and had spent most of her adult life trying to manage, was the particular kind of loneliness that came from being the smartest person in any room and the least visible. She was aware, in the way that only very self-aware people can be aware of something painful about themselves, that she had arranged her entire life around being overlooked. She wore drab colors because bright ones felt presumptuous. She stayed late at the office, not because she loved the work, but because the work was the one place where her brain was exactly the right size for the task, and nobody cared what the rest of her looked like. She had learned early and thoroughly that she was the kind of woman who was useful before she was anything else. She had made her peace with it, mostly, on good days. The Thursday after Graff disappeared, Callum Rourke came to the accounting department. Nobody had ever seen him on this floor. She heard the shift in atmosphere before she saw him, the sudden straightening, the lowered voices, the way the 2 junior accountants near the door seemed to stop breathing. She looked up from her monitor. He was alone. He was in a dark grey suit today, still with the tie loosened by that precise half-inch. He walked directly to her desk in the same unhurried way he did everything, as though the floor had agreed to cooperate, and he stopped, and he looked at her. Miss Reeves, he said. Mr. Rourke, she said. Do you have a moment? She looked at her screen. She looked back at him. My entire afternoon is reconciliation entries, she said. They'll keep. He pulled a chair from the empty desk beside hers, didn't ask, just moved it, and sat down. He wasn't a man who asked permission for things. She had understood that almost immediately. I need to restructure the financial oversight of the freight operation, he said. I've been relying on a reporting structure that has an obvious flaw. He looked at her directly. I'd like to offer you a position as Director of Internal Audit. Salary is 4 times your current rate. You would report directly to me, and only to me. You would have full access to every account, every subsidiary, every transaction. No one screens what you see. Alma was quiet for a moment. Outside, the junior accountants were very aggressively pretending to work. You're not worried, she said slowly, that I'd document everything I found. You already do, he said. That's why I'm asking you. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He had a way of doing that, of meeting her eyes without flinching, or looking away, or doing the thing most people did, which was sort of look at her and through her at the same time. I'll need the documentation on the graph accounts, she said. Everything you have on the subsidiary, and I'll need authorization to flag any transaction above 50,000 to my own review queue before it clears. Done, he said. And I'll need an office with a door that locks. I'll have one cleared by Monday. She nodded once. Then yes, he stood. He looked at her for one more moment, that same quality of attention that she had never experienced from anyone, the kind that felt like being genuinely, entirely seen. And then he walked out of the accounting department without looking at anyone else. She turned back to her screen. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the desk and counted backwards from 20 until they stopped. She started in the new office on Monday. It was on the 3rd floor, with a window that looked out over the harbor and a door that locked with a key she kept on her person at all times. Perot appeared on her first morning with a stack of files and the closest thing to an apologetic expression she suspected he was capable of. She thanked him and started reading. The structure of the organization was more complex than she had understood from the accounts alone. It was, she gathered, several things at once. Legitimate freight operations layered over the kind of business that did not get filed with the SEC and did not have shareholder meetings. She had known something like this was true. Knowing it formally was different. She sat with it over her lunch break, a sandwich she'd brought from home, eaten at her desk, and decided that she was going to do her job, the job she'd been hired to do. She was very good at it, and she intended to keep being good at it, and she was not going to lose sleep over things that were above her clearance level. That was what she told herself. The truth was more complicated. The truth was that she had been inside that warehouse and seen Callum Rourke in person, and her brain, which was, she could admit, occasionally inconvenient, had not stopped thinking about the way he had looked at her since. She was not naive. She was not the kind of woman who read things into moments that weren't there. She was, if anything, constitutionally inclined to discount the possibility that any moment was there at all. But she had been very thoroughly looked at, twice now, and she didn't know what to do with that. She ate her sandwich. She read the files. She told Wallace about it when she got home that evening, and he yawned so widely she could see all his teeth, which she took as reasonable editorial feedback. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That was the strange part. She audited. She flagged. She built a new oversight structure that was cleaner and harder to exploit than anything the organization had used before. People on the executive floor learned her name, which was novel. Perot, she discovered, had a dry sense of humor and made excellent coffee, which he sometimes left on her desk in the mornings without comment. Rourke came to her office twice a week, always with specific questions, always with his sleeves rolled up and that same half-loosened tie, and they talked about numbers and accounts and structural irregularities with the ease of 2 people who spoke the same language. She thought, privately and with great caution, that she might be almost happy. She should have known better. She was working late on a Wednesday. It was always the Wednesdays that got away from her, when she heard the commotion from the stairwell. Not loud, not chaotic, Something more controlled than that, which was somehow worse. She heard Perrault's voice, pitched flat and urgent, and then silence, and then the door to her office opened. It was not Perrault. There were two men. They were not men she knew. One of them was on his phone. The other looked at her with the specific expressionlessness of someone who has decided not to think too hard about what they're doing. "Phone on the desk," said the one on his phone. Without looking up, Alma set her phone on the desk. "Who sent you?" she said. It wasn't a question. She said it the way she had learned to say things. Flat, steady, as though she already knew the answer and was just confirming. Neither of them replied. They walked her out of the building through the loading dock, not the front, not the side, the loading dock where the trucks came in, and into a second black vehicle, this one a sedan with plates she memorized out of habit, and drove her 40 minutes north to a building she didn't recognize in a neighborhood that was trying very hard to look ordinary. Inside, it was not ordinary. She was put in a room with no windows. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a lamp in the corner. She sat in one of the chairs and kept her back straight and her expression neutral and her thoughts moving very quickly. Leonard Graff walked in 12 minutes later. He looked worse than she remembered. He'd lost weight. His eyes had the overlit quality of a man running on adrenaline and bad decisions. And when he sat down across from her, he was carrying a folder that he set on the table between them with the careful deliberateness of a man who wanted to seem more in control than he was. "Alma," he said. "Leonard," she said. "I know you've been in the accounts," he said. "I know what you found. I need to know what you gave Rourke." She looked at him. She thought about what it must have cost him to admit that he knew she'd found him. Leonard Graff had always thought himself the smartest person in any room he occupied. It must have been extraordinary, finding out she'd been tracking him for 8 months. "I gave him everything," she said. "You know that." "There's more," he said. "There's a second account. I need to know if you found it." She kept her face very still. She had found it. She'd found it 3 weeks ago. A secondary disbursement account, older and cleaner than the Rotterdam one, routing through a charitable foundation in Virginia. She hadn't told Rourke yet, because she'd been building the full picture first. That was how she worked. She never handed over half a thing. "I'd like to know," she said carefully, "what you plan to offer me in exchange for that information." Graff's face shifted. "You're not in a position to negotiate." "I'm in the only position that matters," she said. "I'm the one who knows what's in the accounts and what isn't. You need that. Whatever you're planning to do with it, you need me functional and cooperative to get it." She held his gaze. "So I'll ask again. What are you offering?" He leaned forward. "Immunity. I have people who can make you untouchable. From Rourke. From everyone." She looked at the folder. She looked at Leonard Graff. She thought about 14 months of careful documentation and the encrypted drive at home on her nightstand. She thought about Wallace. She thought about an office with a window that looked out over the harbor and a key she kept on her person at all times. "No," she said. He looked at her. "No," she said again, in case it hadn't been clear. There was a long pause. Then Graff stood up, and his expression had gone from urgent to something colder, and he said, "That's unfortunate," and left the room. The man with the expressionless face came back. He was less careful this time. She ended up on the floor of the room, with a split lip and a pain in her ribs that made it hard to breathe, which she decided to interpret as at least 2 cracked ones. She pressed her back against the wall and focused on breathing slowly, and thought about the secondary account in Virginia and everything she knew and hadn't said. She did not make a sound. She was not going to give Leonard Graff the satisfaction. She didn't know how much time passed. The lamp was the only light, and it didn't change. She had stopped counting at some point, which was unlike her. She was aware, distantly, that she might be in some degree of shock, which she found almost funny, in a grim sort of way. She had always been so careful to avoid situations exactly like this one, and here she was anyway. She heard the commotion before she heard the door. It started as a distant sound, too organized to be random, too rapid to be routine. And then it got closer. There were voices. Something that might have been a door coming off its hinges. She heard Graf's voice, raised for the first time, and then cut off. The door to her room opened. Perrault stood in the doorway. He took in the situation with the economy of expression she had come to associate with him specifically, and said, very quietly, "Miss Reeves, can you stand?" "Yes," she said, and then she tried, and she revised her answer. "Mostly." He crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched down beside her. He did not touch her until she nodded, and then he helped her up with a steadiness that she was grateful for. She got her feet under her. Her ribs objected strenuously. "How did you?" She started. "The phone you left on your desk," he said. "You'd been on a call with the audit system." The line stayed open, we heard. She thought about that. She thought about how she had set the phone on the desk when instructed, and how she had not actually ended the call she'd been on. "I didn't do that on purpose," she said. "I know," said Perrault. The building outside her room was a different kind of chaos now. Controlled, purposeful, the organized aftermath of something that had been handled. She didn't ask about Graf. She thought she could infer the answer from the quality of the silence coming from whatever room he'd gone to. Perrault walked her through the building and outside into the cold October air. And there was the black car, and there was the smell of diesel, and the distant sound of the water, and there was Callum Rourke standing 20 feet away with his jacket off, and his sleeves rolled up, and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. He crossed the distance between them at a pace that was just short of running. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, at the split lip and the eye that was already swelling, and something moved across his features that she didn't have a word for. Something that looked like the controlled detonation of something he usually kept very well contained. His hands came up, carefully. His fingers were gentle against her jaw, tilting her face toward the light from the car, and he looked at her the way he looked at everything, directly, completely, without flinching. Except that this time there was nothing professional about it. "Tell me you're all right," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I've been better," she said honestly. "Alma." It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, catalogued it, filed it, kept it. "I'm all right," she said. "2 cracked ribs, I think. Lip will heal. Nothing permanent." He didn't move his hands. She didn't ask him to. "Graf," she said. "Handled." "There's a secondary account," she said. "A charitable foundation in Virginia. I have the full documentation at home. I've had it for 3 weeks. I was going to bring it to you when I had the complete picture." She paused. "I'm sorry I didn't bring it sooner." He looked at her. "You were building the full picture. That's how I work," she said. "I don't hand over half a thing." "I know," he said. "That's not why I came." She looked up at him. The night was cold, and there were men moving purposefully in every direction around them, and his hands were still gentle against her face, and Callum Rourke was looking at her with an expression that she had spent her entire professional life telling herself she was misreading in other people. She was not misreading this. "You came to a building full of Graf's people," she said. "For a bookkeeper, director of internal audit," he said, and now she was certain that was almost a smile. "And no, I came for you." He said it the way he said most things, without hesitation, without wasted words, as though the floor had agreed to cooperate. "I've known where you were from the moment you walked into that room with Graf's men. I've had a team in position for 3 hours. I was waiting to confirm you were unhurt before I moved, and when it was clear you were not unhurt," he stopped. "I stopped waiting." Alma was quiet for a moment. "You knew," she said slowly. 3 hours. You had a team." "Yes." She thought about that. She thought about 3 years of being invisible, of making herself small, of the drab colors, and the pulled-back hair and the lunch eaten alone at a desk. because the break room made her nervous. She thought about 14 months of documentation and a drive on her nightstand and a cat named Wallace who regarded her with profound skepticism, and was currently, she realized, waiting to be fed. "How long?" she said. "Have you been paying attention to me?" The question hung in the cold air. Callum Rourke looked at her. The controlled detonation from before had settled into something steadier, something that looked very much like certainty. "Since your first week," he said, "you flagged an irregularity in the doc receivables report. A small one, barely visible, the kind most bookkeepers miss on a good day. You flagged it in your first week. I asked Deborah to pull your file, and then I read it twice." He paused. "You've been anything but invisible, Alma. You've just been looking in the wrong direction to notice that someone was looking back." The cold air came off the water. Somewhere behind her, Perot was giving quiet instructions to someone. The night was doing what nights did, which was keep moving regardless of what people decided to do inside it. She looked at Callum Rourke. She thought about the wrong directions she had spent her life looking in, and all the things she'd told herself because of it, and what it might mean to stop. "My cat," she said, "hasn't been fed." He blinked, just once. "Perot will send someone," he said. "Wallace is particular," she said. "He doesn't like strangers. Then we'll go ourselves," he said without missing a beat. "As soon as the medic looks at your ribs." She considered this. She considered the medic and Wallace, and the drive on her nightstand, and the secondary account in Virginia, and the way Callum Rourke's hands had not moved from her face. Still gentle, still careful, still treating her like something worth being careful with. "All right," she said. There was a moment, just a moment, where neither of them moved, and the city went on around them being large and indifferent the way cities are, and Alma Reeves, who had spent the better part of a decade making herself invisible, stood in a parking lot north of Baltimore in her second-best cardigan, with a split lip and cracked ribs, and thought, with the clarity that sometimes arrived after a very bad night. Maybe that was enough of that. The medic confirmed 2 cracked ribs, taped them, told her to rest and not lift anything heavy, and gave her something for the pain that she accepted, and then did not take because she preferred to keep her head clear. She sat in the back of the car while someone retrieved the documentation from her apartment. Rourke had come himself, as promised. Wallace had sniffed his hand and then retreated to the bedroom, which she chose to read as approval, or at least not active hostility, and she answered his questions about the Virginia Foundation with the same precision she brought to every financial conversation, and they talked for 2 hours in the quiet of the car, while the city went past the windows, and the pain in her ribs settled into something manageable. At some point, she fell asleep. She was aware of it only because she woke up, briefly, in a way that told her she had been out for a while. She was in the back seat, and her head was against something solid and warm, and there was a jacket over her that hadn't been there before. And Callum Rourke, who was apparently capable of doing things quietly, when he chose to, was reading something on his phone with one hand and had his other arm. She processed this slowly, around her shoulders in a way that suggested she had listed toward him in her sleep, and he had not moved away. She closed her eyes again. She was very good with numbers. She could count 14 months of careful documentation, 2 cracked ribs, 1 cat with strong opinions, 3 years of making herself small, and 1 man who had been paying attention since her first week and had stopped waiting the moment she was hurt. She was good at adding things up. She slept. The following Monday, she came to work in a deep red blouse she'd had in the back of her closet for 2 years and had never worn because she'd told herself it was too much. She unlocked her office door, hung her coat, and sat down at her desk with the harbor out her window, going silver in the early light. And she opened the Virginia Foundation file and started at the beginning. At 8:30, Perot set a coffee on the corner of her desk without a word. At 9:15, Callum Rourke knocked once. He did not usually knock, and opened her door and stood in the threshold, and looked at her the way he always did, and said, "The Virginia account, fully documented," she said, "ready when you are." He looked at the red blouse. He looked at her face, at the healing lip and the eye that was only slightly still swollen. He looked at her in the way that she had decided, on the drive north of Baltimore, and again in the parking lot, and again in the back of a car while the city went past, that she was not going to talk herself out of. "Good," he said. He came in. He pulled the chair. He sat down. She opened the file. Outside, the harbor was silver and still, and Wallace was home on her bed disapproving of everything, and the numbers were clean, and Alma Reeves, who was plain and quiet and very, very good at her job, let herself take up exactly the right amount of space and got to work.